Get off my property, Alma. You don't belong here anymore. Stavros Hyde sneered, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit as he stood on the porch of the Wyoming ranch her family built. Beside him, Raywin Jacob laughed, a harsh, brittle sound cutting through the freezing rain. She twirled the ranch's master keys around her manicured finger. Take your junk and go, sweetie. Tony Federico, their slick lawyer, shoved a single rusted brass key into Alma's trembling hand. Your grandfather's old hunting cabin. That's all you get. Now, trespasser, leave. Alma Werner stood in the mud of the driveway, the icy rain plastering her dark hair to her cheeks. She stared up at the massive timber-framed lodge of the Werner Ranch, a sprawling estate nestled in the shadow of Cody, Wyoming. For 3 generations, her family had worked this land. Her grandfather, Dusan Wallace, had bled into the soil to build a legacy out of the unforgiving wilderness. Now, it was being stolen from her in broad daylight. Stavros Hyde, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart and her inheritance, looked down at her with a gaze devoid of any human warmth. He was a creature of corporate boardrooms and calculated risks, wearing his vintage Rolex Submariner and custom Lucchese boots like armor. He had methodically isolated Alma, drowning the ranch in shadow debts she never knew existed, restructuring the deeds while she was busy grieving her grandfather's passing. Standing pressed against Stavros was Raywin Jacob. Raywin had been Alma's supposed best friend, the confidant who had offered her a shoulder to cry on when Dusan died. Now, Raywin was draped in a cashmere coat that Alma recognized as her own, looking down at her with an expression of triumphant malice. Raywin's lips were painted a vicious crimson, pulled into a smirk that spoke of long-held jealousy finally satisfied. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Alma, Stavros said, his voice smooth and dead. The foreclosure is legal. The transfer of the deed is final. Tani made sure of it. Tani Federico stepped forward from the shadows of the porch. The lawyer was a rat of a man in a sharp Italian suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the rugged western landscape. He clutched a leather briefcase to his chest, as if it contained the Holy Grail. Miss Werner, I assure you, fighting this will only drain what little dignity you have left. The Werner Ranch now belongs to Hyde Enterprises. The only asset not seized in the restructuring is the dilapidated structure on the North Ridge, the hunting cabin. Alma looked down at the heavy, rusted brass key Tani had dropped into her palm. It was cold, biting into her skin. Her knuckles were white. The sheer audacity of the betrayal left her breathless, a physical ache radiating from her chest. They hadn't just taken her home. They had orchestrated a systematic dismantling of her life. You forged his signature, Alma said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the sharp edge of a drawn blade. Dusan Wallace would have rather burned this ranch to the ground than sell a single acre to a snake like you, Stavros. Stavros chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. Your grandfather was a dinosaur, Alma. He didn't understand the modern world. He sat on thousands of acres of prime real estate and did nothing. I'm going to develop this valley. Hughes Caffarelli is flying in from Geneva next week to finalize the resort buyout. We are talking hundreds of millions. It's blood money, Alma retorted, her amber eyes blazing through the tears that threatened to fall. You will choke on it. Raywin rolled her eyes, stepping closer to the edge of the porch. Oh, save the dramatic pioneer woman act, Alma. It's pathetic. Take your little key, get in your beat-up Ford, and disappear before we have the sheriff arrest you for loitering. Alma wanted to scream. She wanted to charge the porch and tear the smug satisfaction from their faces, but she was alone. The ranch hands, men she had known since childhood, had been fired and replaced by private security contractors with cold eyes and holstered sidearms. There was no fight left to be won here, not today. She closed her fist around the brass key, its jagged teeth pressed into her palm, a sharp reminder of the only man who had never lied to her. Dusan Wallace had given her this key years ago, telling her it opened a place where the world couldn't reach her. Without another word, Alma turned her back on the sprawling lodge. She walked through the deepening mud toward her 1998 Ford F-250 250, the truck's faded red paint peeling like sunburned skin. She didn't look back as she climbed into the cab. She turned the ignition, the old V8 engine roaring to life with a defiant rumble that temporarily drowned out Raywin's mocking laughter. Slipping the truck into gear, Alma drove down the long cottonwood-lined driveway, the heavy iron gates of the Werner Ranch closing behind her with a sound like a prison door locking shut. She was 28 years old, utterly alone, stripped of her wealth, her home, and her pride. All she had was a half-tank of gas, the clothes on her back, and a key to a cabin she hadn't seen since she was 10 years old. The drive from Cody up into the high country of the Shoshone National Forest was a treacherous, solitary journey. The Wyoming sky, usually a vast canopy of brilliant blue, was a bruised, oppressive gray, pregnant with the threat of a heavy spring blizzard. Alma gripped the steering wheel of the Ford, her knuckles aching as she navigated the winding switchbacks of the Chief Joseph Scenic Byway. The heater in the old truck blasted dry, dusty air, but it did nothing to chase away the deep, bone-chilling cold that had settled in her chest. Tears finally fell, hot and fast, tracking through the dust on her face. She sobbed, the sound muffled by the roar of the engine and the howling wind rattling the truck's windows. She mourned the loss of her grandfather, Doosan, the stoic, leather-skinned patriarch who had taught her how to ride, how to shoot, and how to read the weather in the clouds. She mourned the betrayal of Stavros, the man who had whispered promises of forever while quietly digging a grave for her future. And she mourned Raywin, the friend she had trusted with her deepest insecurities, who had weaponized them for a piece of stolen luxury. The highway turned into a poorly maintained county road, which eventually degraded into a deeply rutted, two-track dirt trail cutting through a dense forest of lodgepole pines. The elevation climbed steadily. The rain transitioned into fat, wet flakes of snow that stuck to the windshield, forcing the wipers to work overtime. Alma's mind raced as she drove. Tony Federico's words echoed in her ears. Hyde Enterprises. Hughes Caffarelli. She knew of Caffarelli. He was a ruthless international developer, famous for buying up pristine wilderness across the American West and turning it into exclusive, gated enclaves for the ultra-rich. If Caffarelli was buying the Werner Ranch, Stavros wasn't just stealing her home. He was permanently destroying the ecosystem, the migration routes of the elk, the very soul of the land Doosan had fought to protect. After 2 hours of brutal driving, the truck's headlights swept across a small clearing at the end of the trail. Nestled against a sheer rock face, half swallowed by the encroaching forest, sat the cabin. It was a bleak sight. Built from massive, hand-hewn cedar logs, the structure slumped to one side, its roof thick with decades of pine needles and moss. The front porch sagged dangerously, and the single window beside the heavy oak door was opaque with grime and frost. It looked like a place forgotten by time and abandoned by hope. Alma killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, deafening in its intensity. She sat in the cab for a long moment, watching her breath plume in the freezing air. Doubt gnawed at her. What was she doing here? She had $50 in her checking account and half a tank of gas. She couldn't survive here. She was a modern rancher, used to accounting software and veterinary schedules, not a mountain hermit. But as her hand brushed the heavy brass key in her pocket, she felt a strange surge of resolve. Doosan had left this to her. Only this. Why? He owned vast tracts of land, bank accounts, investments. Why was this isolated shack the only property he had kept entirely separate from the ranch's corporate holding? The only thing Tony Federico couldn't legally sink his claws into. She pushed open the truck door, stepping out into the biting wind. The snow was already an inch deep, crunching under her boots. She walked up the sagging steps, her weight making the rotting wood groan in protest. She stood before the heavy oak door. The padlock was massive, a rusted iron beast from a bygone era. Alma pulled the brass key from her pocket. It looked too old, too delicate for the heavy padlock. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the keyway. It resisted for a moment, the internal tumbler stiff with years of disuse. She wiggled it, applied pressure, and turned. With a heavy, metallic clack, the padlock released. Alma unwound the thick iron chain, letting it fall heavily to the floorboards. She pushed the oak door. It screamed on its hinges, resisting her before finally giving way, opening into the pitch-black interior of the cabin. A wave of stale, musty air washed over her, the smell of dry rot, old wood smoke, and undisturbed dust. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her smartphone to use the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the gloom, revealing a Spartan room. A rusted wood-burning stove sat in the corner. A simple cot, with a moth-eaten Pendleton blanket, lay against one wall. A sturdy oak table and a single chair occupied the center. It was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood, yet utterly alien in her current despair. Alma stepped inside, pulling the heavy door shut against the howling wind. She was entirely cut off from the world, kicked out, cast aside, left with nothing but the dust of a dead man's memory. But as she shined her light across the floorboards, looking for a place to sit, she didn't know that she had just stepped into the epicenter of Stavros Hyde's absolute destruction. The first priority was warmth. Alma found a stack of dry, seasoned oak stacked neatly beside the rusted potbelly stove Duson's foresight, a testament to the old man's belief in always being prepared. Her hands were numb as she arranged the kindling, striking a match from a waterproof tin she found on the mantel. Soon, a fire crackled to life, casting dancing orange shadows against the log walls and driving the bitter Wyoming chill from the small room. Alma sat in the lone wooden chair, wrapping the dusty Pendleton blanket around her shoulders. The wind outside roared, battering the cabin like a physical assault, but the thick log walls held strong. She stared into the flames, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids, but her mind refused to rest. She looked around the room, illuminated by the firelight and a single kerosene lantern she had managed to light. It was sparse, too sparse. Duson Wallace had been a man of secrets, a man who didn't trust banks and despised digital records. If he had deliberately excluded this cabin from the ranch's legal trust, he had done so for a reason. "What did you leave me, Grandpa?" she whispered to the empty room. She stood up, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders. She began to systematically search the cabin. She checked beneath the mattress, behind the cast-iron stove, and felt along the chinking between the logs. Nothing. She examined the small, rough-hewn shelves, holding a few tin cups and expired cans of beans. Still nothing. Frustration mounted, bitter and sharp. Had she been a fool? Was this truly just an old hunting shack? A final insult orchestrated by Stavros to watch her freeze in the wilderness? Alma paced the room, her heavy boots thudding against the wide plank pine floor. Thud, thud, thud. She stopped. She took a step back. Thud. She stepped to the left. Hollow clack. Alma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She dropped to her knees, running her hands over the rough wood. It was near the center of the room, partially concealed beneath the heavy oak table. She grabbed her phone, shining the flashlight directly onto the grain. The boards looked identical, but one plank had a faint, almost imperceptible seam running along its edge, too straight to be a natural crack in the wood. She scrambled to the fireplace, grabbed a heavy iron fire poker, and returned to the spot. Wedging the flattened tip of the poker into the seam, she threw her weight against it. The wood groaned, resisted, and then popped upward with a loud crack, sending up a cloud of ancient dust. Alma pulled the loose floorboard aside. Beneath it, nestled in a square cavity cut into the foundational joists, sat a heavy fireproof iron lockbox. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The box was heavy, requiring both hands to lift it onto the oak table. It didn't have a padlock. Instead, it had a complex mechanical combination dial. Alma stared at it. A combination. She thought of Duson. What numbers mattered to him? His birthday? The day the ranch was founded? She tried combinations of dates, sweating despite the chill in the air. Nothing. She tried her own birthday. Nothing. Then, she remembered the story he used to tell her by the fire. The year the great blizzard wiped out half the herd. The year he nearly lost the ranch but fought off the bank with a Winchester and sheer grit. The winter of 1978. With trembling fingers, she spun the heavy brass dial. 1978. She grasped the heavy latch and pulled. A loud metallic click echoed in the quiet cabin, and the lid swung open. Alma peered inside, the kerosene light flickering over the contents. The first thing she saw was the dull, oiled gleam of gunmetal. It was a pristine, antique, Colt single-action Army revolver, wrapped in oiled cloth, resting beside a box of heavy, .45 Colt ammunition. But the gun wasn't what made Alma's breath leave her body in a rush. Beneath the revolver lay thick stacks of documents. Bound in leather and tied with twine, they were old, some yellowed, some crisp and official-looking, bearing the heavy embossed seals of the state of Wyoming and the United States federal government. She lifted the top bundle, untying the twine. There was a letter, handwritten in Duson's sharp, spidery cursive, addressed directly to her. Alma, my tough little girl, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the wolves have come to the door. I knew Stavros Hyde was a snake the day he stepped onto my land. I saw the greed in his eyes, but I also saw you loved him, and a stubborn Werner won't be told who to love. I couldn't stop you from marrying him, but I could stop him from stealing our legacy. Tony Federico is a corrupt fool. They think they restructured the ranch. They think they own the dirt. But they don't know history. Alma's eyes widened as she read on. Duson explained that long before the modern deeds were drawn up, long before the LLCs and corporate trusts were formed, his father had secured an overriding federal land patent and an unseverable blanket mineral and water rights claim directly from the Bureau of Land Management in 1922. These documents, kept hidden from local county clerks to prevent corporate espionage, superseded any modern surface deed. Stavros thinks he owns the Werner Ranch, the letter concluded. But without the original patents in this box, his deeds are worthless paper. He cannot sell the water rights to Caffarelli. He cannot break ground. I transferred these master patents directly into your name, Alma, in a blind trust administered by the only honest man left in Cody, Judge Lawrence Christensen. Take this box to him. Take back your home. Make them bleed. Alma dropped the letter onto the table. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, but not from the cold. A fierce, wild heat was rising in her blood. Stavros and Raywin had kicked her out, thinking they had left her with nothing. Instead, they had handed her the very weapon that would destroy them. She reached into the box, her fingers brushing the cold steel of the Colt revolver before resting firmly on the heavy stack of federal patents. She looked up, her amber eyes reflecting the flames of the stove. The girl who had been crying in the mud was dead. The woman sitting in the cabin was a Werner, and she was going to war. By first light, the storm had broken, leaving the Absaroka Mountains buried beneath a pristine layer of blinding white snow. Alma didn't sleep. She had spent the night poring over the documents by lantern light, absorbing the sheer, brilliant legal trap her grandfather had laid. Duson hadn't just protected the land. He had built a ticking time bomb directly beneath Stavros Hyde's feet. She packed the documents back into the iron box, wrapped the antique Colt in its oiled cloth, and placed it in her duffel bag, and locked the cabin door behind her. The drive down the mountain was treacherous, the Ford slipping on the icy switchbacks, but Alma's grip on the wheel was ironclad. Arriving in Cody, she didn't head for the polished corporate district where Tony Federico kept his sleek office. Instead, she drove to Sheridan Avenue, parking in front of the historic Irma Hotel. The town was waking up, ranchers and oilmen shaking snow from their Stetsons as they headed in for morning coffee. Alma walked 2 blocks down to a small, unassuming brick building. The gold leaf lettering on the frosted glass door read, Lawrence Christensen, Attorney at Law, retired circuit judge. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The office smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and strong black coffee. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Lawrence Christensen. He was a mountain of a man in his late 70s, with a thick shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was a legend in Wyoming, a man known for ruining corrupt politicians and upholding the law with a ruthless Old West sense of justice. Lawrence looked up from his reading glasses, his expression turning from mild annoyance to profound shock as he recognized her. Alma Werner. Good God, girl. You look like you've been dragged behind a horse through a mile of bad road. I heard what happened at the ranch yesterday. I was about to call the sheriff and have a posse ride up to that lodge. There's no need for a posse, Lawrence, Alma said, her voice raspy but steady. She walked to his desk and slammed the heavy iron box down onto the mahogany. Grandpa Doosan left me a key. Lawrence's eyes widened. He stood up slowly, staring at the iron box as if it were a ghost. He actually did it. The stubborn old bastard actually did it. You knew, Alma said, crossing her arms. I drafted the blind trust, Alma, Lawrence said, stepping around his desk. He ran a weathered hand over the lid of the box. Decades ago, Doosan knew the valley was changing. He knew the corporate sharks would eventually circle. He transferred the paramount federal patents and the deep mineral rights, the actual blood of the land, into a secure trust. Your name is the sole beneficiary, but the trust was only triggered upon his death, and the physical documents were required to execute it. Documents he hid. Alma opened the box, pulling out the thick sheaf of papers with the federal seals. She laid them out on Lawrence's desk. Stavros thinks he owns the ranch. He evicted me yesterday. Tony Federico handled the paperwork. Lawrence let out a sharp, barking laugh that held no humor. Federico is a bottom feeder. He likely processed a standard surface deed transfer, assuming the Werner holdings were conventional. He didn't dig deep enough at the state archives. These patents, Lawrence tapped a heavy finger on an ancient wax-sealed document, are absolute. Under Wyoming law, surface rights are subservient to mineral and water rights. Without your signature, Stavros High doesn't own a ranch. He owns a very expensive patch of dirt he can't legally build on, draw water from, or sell. He's selling it, Alma said, her eyes narrowing, to Hughes Caffarelli. They're planning a massive resort development. Stavros said Caffarelli is flying in this week to finalize the deal. Lawrence stopped smiling. The mention of Caffarelli changed the atmosphere in the room. The French-American billionaire was not a man to be trifled with. He commanded armies of lawyers and had a reputation for destroying anyone who wasted his time or money. If Stavros signs a contract with Caffarelli claiming free and clear title and takes Caffarelli's money, Lawrence trailed off, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his weathered face. It's wire fraud, Alma finished. Federal wire fraud on a massive scale. It's theft by deception. Caffarelli will crucify him, and the feds will bury him. Exactly, Lawrence said, his blue eyes flashing with a dangerous light. Stavros and Raywin are currently parading around town, acting like the new kings of Park County. Let them climb as high as they can. The higher they go, the harder the impact when they hit the ground. Lawrence walked to a heavy steel safe in the corner of his office, spinning the dial. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and a Mont Blanc pen. We need to file the execution of the trust and register these patents with the federal district court immediately. We put a quiet, unannounced lien on the property. We let them proceed with the Caffarelli meeting. Alma leaned over the desk, her expression harder than the iron box she had brought down the mountain. I don't just want the ranch back, Lawrence. I want to see Stavros Hyde and Raywin Jacob lose everything. I want them to feel exactly what I felt standing in the mud yesterday. Lawrence looked at her, seeing the ghost of Doosan Wallace standing in the room. Oh, they will, Alma. In the eyes of the law, setting a trap isn't illegal, provided the rat walks into it willingly. And Stavros is a very greedy rat. 70 miles away in Jackson Hole, Stavros Hyde swirled his Macallan 25, feeling invincible. Across the table, Raywin dripped in stolen Werner diamonds. The Werner girl hasn't made a peep, Tony Federico noted, his rat-like face glowing. Probably crying into a dirty blanket at that old cabin. Stavros smirked. Alma is weak. What matters is tomorrow. Caffarelli's plane lands at noon. We sign for $250 million, dissolve the company, and relocate to Monaco. Untouchable, Tony fidgeted. You're sure the title is clean? I paid you to make it clean. Stavros snapped. Dusan is dead. Alma is penniless. We get our empire. Meanwhile, in Cody, the trap snapped shut. Alma signed a mountain of documents in Lawrence's office. The old patents were authenticated and layered over the Werner title like a titanium net. It's done, Lawrence said, stamping the injunction. Stavros has zero legal authority to sell. The injunction is sealed. He won't know until the hammer falls at the catered luncheon he's hosting for Caffarelli tomorrow. Alma stood up, donning her grandfather's Stetson. She unwrapped the antique Colt revolver. It was empty. She didn't need bullets for this execution, just the weight of history. She holstered it on her hip. I'll have the federal marshals and FBI on standby, Lawrence grinned. Caffarelli has been quietly warned. He knows what's coming. Alma walked to the door, gazing at the blood-orange sunset. She had been kicked out with a rusted key, but tomorrow she was bringing the storm. The grand dining room of the Werner Lodge was a masterpiece of rustic luxury. Massive elk antler chandeliers cast a warm glow over a long, polished oak table. A catered spread of Wagyu beef and imported champagne sat untouched. Stavros Hyde stood at the head of the table, his smile wide and gleaming. Beside him, Raywin looked like a queen holding court in a designer pantsuit. Tony Federico sweated profusely, nervously arranging the towering stacks of contract documents. Opposite them sat Hugues Caffarelli. The French-American billionaire was a striking man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes as cold and gray as a winter ocean. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored dark suit. He didn't smile. He exuded an aura of immense, quiet power. Two massive security contractors stood stoically behind his chair. As you can see, Mr. Caffarelli, Stavros smoothly presented, sweeping his hand toward the massive bay windows overlooking the snow-covered valley. The property is unparalleled. 10,000 acres of contiguous, unblemished wilderness. Free and clear title. The water rights are pristine. Caffarelli picked up a silver pen, rolling it between his fingers. He looked at the contract in front of him. Free and clear, Mr. Hyde? You are absolutely certain? I do not like complications. Complete certainty, Tony Federico chimed in, his voice cracking slightly. All prior claims were extinguished through the restructuring. Excellent, Caffarelli said softly. He pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. Before the ink could touch the page, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open with a resounding crash. Stavros jumped. Raywin let out a startled shriek. Alma Werner stood in the doorway. She was a vision of absolute retribution, framed by the dark timber of the hall. The antique Colt rested heavy on her hip, her grandfather's Stetson casting a dark shadow over her blazing amber eyes. Flanking her was Judge Lawrence Christensen, looking like an angry god of the Old Testament. Behind them, standing in the foyer, were three men wearing windbreakers with bold yellow letters. FBI. What the hell is this? Stavros roared, his face flushing crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at Alma. You are trespassing. Security. Get this crazy bitch out of here. The private contractors Stavros had hired moved forward, but they stopped dead in their tracks as the FBI agent stepped into the room, hands resting casually near their weapons. Alma walked slowly into the dining room, her boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She didn't look at Stavros. She walked straight to the table and locked eyes with Caffarelli. Mr. Caffarelli, Alma said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. My name is Alma Werner. I am the sole heir to the Werner Ranch, and the legal owner of the paramount federal land patents and unseverable mineral rights to every inch of dirt beneath this lodge. Stavros let out a frantic, hysterical laugh. She's lying. She's a disgruntled ex-wife. Tunny, show him the deeds. Lawrence Christensen stepped forward, slamming a heavy leather binder onto the table directly on top of Stavros's contracts. You can look at Mr. Federico's fraudulent surface deeds, Hughes, or you can look at the federally registered injunction filed at 4 p.m. yesterday, proving that Mr. Hyde has zero legal authority to sell this land. Caffarelli calmly put his pen down. He opened the binder Lawrence had provided. He scanned the documents, his cold gray eyes flicking over the federal seals. He looked up at Stavros. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You attempted to sell me land you do not own," Caffarelli said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You attempted to defraud me of $250 million. No, Hughes, listen to me. There's a mistake," Stavros stammered, the color draining from his face completely. He turned on Tunny. "Tunny, fix this. You said it was clean." Tunny Federico was hyperventilating, backing away from the table. I only searched the county surface records. I didn't know about federal patents from 1922. It's not my fault." "It's wire fraud, Mr. Hyde," the lead FBI agent said, stepping forward with handcuffs already drawn, "and conspiracy to commit fraud. We have a warrant for your arrest, as well as Mr. Federico and Miss Jacob." Raywin's face contorted in horror. "Me? I didn't do anything. I'm just his fiancé. Stavros, do something." "Shut up, Raywin," Stavros screamed, his polished veneer shattering completely. He looked at Alma, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. You had nothing. You had a rusty key." Alma stepped right up to him. She didn't flinch as the FBI agent grabbed Stavros's arm and wrenched it behind his back. "I had my grandfather's legacy," Alma said softly, her voice dripping with ice. "You wanted the dirt, Stavros. Now you're going to rot in it." The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. Raywin began to sob hysterically as an agent read her rights, stripping the stolen diamond necklace from her throat for evidence. Tunny Federico simply collapsed into a chair, crying into his hands. Caffarelli stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Alma, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his stoic features. "Miss Werner, you played a very dangerous, very brilliant hand. Your grandfather would be proud." "The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Caffarelli," Alma stated firmly. "Not today. Not ever." Caffarelli nodded slowly. "I understand. I prefer dealing with lions, anyway. Good day." He turned and walked out, his security detail trailing behind him. Alma stood in the center of the dining room, watching as Stavros, Raywin, and Tunny were dragged out the front doors, their arrogant reign ending in the back of federal cruisers. The massive ranch was quiet again. Lawrence placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, kid. Doosan is smiling down right now." Alma walked to the massive bay window. The sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the snow-capped peaks of the Absarokas in brilliant, blinding gold. She touched the cold glass, feeling the deep, powerful heartbeat of the land beneath her feet. She had been kicked out with a rusted key, but what she found inside had unlocked her destiny. The Werner Ranch was hers, and the wolves were finally gone. Alma's journey from devastating betrayal to absolute triumph reminds us that our true power doesn't lie in the material things people can take from us, but in the unshakable foundation of who we are and where we come from. Just like Alma, you may face moments where arrogant people try to strip you of your worth, leaving you out in the cold. But remember, the smallest, rustiest key, a hidden talent, a quiet resilience, or the wisdom of those who came before us, can unlock the strength needed to reclaim your life. Hard karma always finds those who operate with greed and malice, while integrity and grit always win the long game. Stand tall on your own foundation. Did Alma's dramatic revenge give you chills? If you loved this story of justice and karma, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their inner strength, and subscribe for more epic, soul-stirring fiction.